Thank you all for coming. I'm Dan Rabin, and I hope you're here for the Branford Forum, because that's what we're going to have. And thank you all for coming out on such a dreary day. I know a lot of us wanted to just roll over and stay in bed today, but this is a great thing. We have a sign-up sheet for the Branford Forum. If you're on it already, if you're getting my emails, then don't bother, because you'll stay on there unless you ask to be taken off. So sign up, write your email down legibly, please, and then in about a week, we're going to have a steering committee meeting at which we discuss the topics that we're going to pursue in the fall. So if you have something you want to hear about, write it down. If you have a speaker in mind, then write it down, and we'll put it all together. We really value. We've got a couple of really good suggestions so far. I won't prejudice you by telling them what they are, but go ahead and write down. Next month, on March 31st, Eric Fine from the Yale program on climate change communication will be coming. He'll be talking a little bit about climate change and also about what we can do about it, the positive steps that are underway in Congress now. So that should be really interesting. On April 28th, Andy Sisson from USAID will be coming. He'll be up from North Carolina, so I hope everybody comes and gives him a hearty welcome. And on May 19th, Jacob Hacker from Yale will be talking about U.S. healthcare policy. So I think that's going to be another great presentation. Today's speaker is Thomas Graham. He spent a long time in the United States State Department. He was the senior director for Russia on the National Security Council staff, and he did 2 tours of duty as a foreign service officer at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. He's part of the Macmillan Center at Yale, and he co-founded the Russian Studies program some 8 years ago. And his quote, day job, he's managing director at Kissinger Associates in New York, where he focuses on Russian and Eurasian affairs. So today's title is Debunking Myths About Russia in U.S. Policymaking. So,
thank you very much, Daniel. It's a real pleasure to be here. Whenever I see such a large audience show up on a dreary day like this on a Sunday afternoon to hear a talk about Russia, I know it's because Russia has done something bad. And I was in Washington earlier or late last week, and I can tell you in Washington that's certainly the point of view. Now, there is a view in Washington on Russia that I can sum up in probably 3 or 4 points. The first is that the problem is really Putin, and that there'll be no improvement in U.S.-Russian relations until Putin leaves the scene. The second is that Russia is a kleptocracy or a mafia state, and that its leaders pursue their own pecuniary interest rather than Russia's own national interest. The third is that Russia is to blame for the deterioration in U.S.-Russian relations, that the United States has pursued a path that should have been acceptable to Russia, and its changes in Russia, largely in its domestic politics, that have led to the deterioration in relations. And the fourth is that Russia is a burgeoning challenge to the United States, and it's a challenge that we need to confront and contain. Now, I'm going to argue that there's a certain element of truth in each of those statements, but it's far from capturing the whole reality of Russia today. And I think a slightly different view of Russia will lead to a better set of American policies over the next several years. Now, what we can all agree on is that U.S.-Russian relations are at their worst state probably since 1983. Now, as I look at this audience, I can see some of you remember 1983. It's quite different from when I teach at Yale. But if you can think back to 1983, you'll remember in the spring of that year, Ronald Reagan talked about Russia or the Soviet Union as the evil empire. In September, there was the shoot down of the KAL 007 that led to the deaths of 269 innocent individuals, including a U.S. congressman. Shortly after that, the United States broke off all its arms control negotiations with the Soviet Union. And then somewhat later than that, there were two incidents that brought us very close to nuclear war. One that grew out of a false set of signals by Soviet radars that indicated that the United States was about to launch or had launched a massive attack on the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union didn't respond only because there was an officer in that warning center that refused to send the report on to the people in the center because he thought there was something wrong with the radar reports he was receiving. And then a few weeks after that, NATO conducted a large military exercise in Europe, one element of which was to test our nuclear launch codes and capabilities. The Soviets saw that, and they thought that this was a cover for a first strike by NATO, by the United States against the Soviet Union. So 1983 really was a bad period in U.S.-Soviet relations. It's also the year that I joined the U.S. government as a Foreign Service officer and began my professional career as a Russia watcher, initially as a Soviet watcher. Now this was the middle of the 1980s, and Gorbachev came to power shortly after I joined the U.S. government, and he began a series of reforms. And he wanted to reform the Soviet Union so that he could sustain the Soviet Union as a major power well into the 21st century. And a significant element of that reform program was reducing tensions with the United States, reducing tensions so that he could focus the efforts on the very urgent need of domestic reconstruction. Now, as we all know, this effort at reform in the end didn't succeed. In fact, it led to the breakup of the Soviet Union and the emergence of Russia as an independent state. The one good thing that did come out of it is that it ended the Cold War. Now, I was working in Washington at this time, and there was great expectation after the breakup of the Soviet Union that the United States had an opportunity to integrate Russia as a democratic, market-oriented society into the Western community of nations. We looked at an opportunity to turn what had been a bitter Cold War rival into a partner with the United States in dealing with those major problems that were going to confront us in the rest of the 20th century and the first decades of the 21st century. Nonproliferation, international terrorism, pandemic diseases, even climate change at that point. And each American president who came to power after the end of the Cold War saw as an important plank in his foreign policy of building constructive relations with Russia. So President Clinton talked about building a strategic alliance with Russian reform. President Bush, the president I worked for in the White House, talked about a qualitatively different relationship with Russia that would put the Cold War behind us. President Obama, as we know, talked about a reset, about working with Russia to eliminate nuclear weapons as a force in global affairs, and also to deal with the challenges of violent extremism. All of those presidents came to power with high hopes for the relationship, and all of them left office with the relations in worse shape than they found them. And now we have President Trump, who's talked about building closer relations with Russia, and we see where we are in the relationship. Now, what you can say is that from the very beginning, we knew it was going to be a significant challenge in building closer relations with Russia. There are a number of reasons. The first is that the national security bureaucracies in both countries still had memories of this bitter conflict during the Cold War, when we saw each other as the main enemy. And it's very difficult for intelligence communities and militaries to overcome the suspicions that they had about what the other side was really up to. So that was a block initially on improved relations, no matter what the presidents of the United States wanted to do at that time. The second is what I call a damaging dialectic of strength and weakness. The two countries were moving in different paths. So in 1990s, the United States experienced one of its longest extended periods of economic growth in its history. At the same time, Russia was in the midst of a deep socioeconomic crisis, unprecedented for a major power not defeated in a major conflict. When Russia began to turn its economy around in the 2000s under President Putin, that corresponded with a growing malaise in the United States. That was a consequence, I would argue, of the failed foreign policy of the Bush administration. We got bogged down in Iraq, we got bogged down in Afghanistan, and it ended with the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. Beyond that, there's always been a tremendous asymmetry between the United States and Russia. Our economy is nearly 15 times the size of Russia's. And that made it almost impossible to create this partnership of equals, which Russia wanted as a way of validating its own self-identification as a major power in global affairs. Now, there are also concrete policies that led to the deterioration in the relationship. So if you think of what the United States did from the moment of the breakup of the Soviet Union, the expansion of NATO, the very active effort to build missile defense, our movement into the former Soviet space in support of many post-Soviet leaders who, mildly putting, were anti-Russian in their orientation. All these types of policies on the part of the United States led the Russian leadership to believe that the real U.S. goal was to contain Russia, to keep it, to exploit its period of weakness for American geopolitical advantage. And there were even some in the Kremlin, Putin among them, that thought the real goal of the United States was regime change in Russia itself. At the same time, the Russians pursued policies that we found problematic. The rhetoric indicated that they didn't accept the sovereignty and independence of the states that emerged from the Soviet Union. They were selling arms to countries that we considered to be hostile to the United States: Venezuela, Syria, and Iran. They were intimately connected in helping the Iranians develop their nuclear power program at that point. There was a lot of very vehement anti-American rhetoric coming out of Moscow. And so we concluded that Russia really wasn't interested in building this type of positive relationship with the United States. But I would argue, beyond that, there was a broader and a deeper reason as to why we couldn't build a close relationship over the past 25 years. And it comes down to a fundamental contradiction in what our expectations and ambitions were. If you think about it, what the United States wanted to do after the breakup of the Soviet Union was to integrate Russia into the Western community as a democratic, market-oriented society, largely along American lines, in a sense to seal the victory that we thought we had won in the Cold War. By contrast, Russia wanted to be accepted and respected by the United States as a major power, as a great power, as a country that had played a large role in overthrowing communism in the Soviet Union itself. And they also wanted to be recognized for the large role that Russia had played throughout history as a major power, certainly in Europe, but also around the globe. So to put it very succinctly, the United States wanted to change Russia, and Russia wanted to restore its power. That, I think, is the fundamental contradiction between the two countries. Now, we have President Trump, who says he wants to build closer relations with Russia. If anybody knows what that means, please raise his or her hand, and I'll turn the rest of the lecture over to you. I don't know what he really has in mind. What I do know is that we've moved into a different era. The Ukraine crisis that erupted in 2014 really is a turning point in U.S.-Russian relations. It opens up a new era. We know that the world has changed in dramatic ways over the past 25 years. The geopolitical challenges, the emergence of China, international terrorism, the disarray in Europe, the problems in our own country. It's also clear that Russia no longer has any intention or desire to be integrated into the Western community. It wants to be an independent country, sovereign state, pursuing its own foreign policy, many times in opposition to the United States. And certainly, the rhetoric that we use in talking about Russia has changed significantly, dramatically over the past couple of years. So if you look at our most recent national security strategy, we clearly identify Russia as a strategic competitor for the United States, with the implication that this situation is going to remain this way well into the future. So what we need is a new approach to Russia, a new policy, and one that takes into account the new era that we are entering. Now, if we're going to build an effective policy towards Russia, we need to see Russia clearly. We need to understand what motivates them and how they look at the world, what they see as their role in the world. And that's what I want to focus the rest of my comments on, is letting in broad terms to try to get us to see the world through the eyes of the Kremlin, and what that means for the way they're going to react to what we do and to other things that happen in the world. Now, I want to start by saying that we're focused on is looking at a Russian view of the world and not simply Putin's. Now, Putin is clearly the paramount leader in Russia today. He has decisive influence on Russia's foreign policy. But I think the more important point is that Putin enjoys tremendous popular support. It's hovering around 60% now. 3 or 4 years ago, it was at 80%. So tremendous popular support. And beyond that, he enjoys elite support. And it's elite support that is based on a consensus view of what Russia's role in the world is and how it should conduct itself. And it's a consensus that in turn is based on a long tradition, a long history in Russian strategic thinking. In other words, Putin really fits into the framework of a Russian leader. And if he were to leave the scene today, you're not really going to get, I would argue, a dramatic change in the way Russia looks at itself and the types of policies that it pursues beyond its borders. Now, there's a widespread, I think, view in the United States, certainly in Washington, that President Putin marks a significant break with President Yeltsin, the first post-Soviet Russian leader, who is generally seen in the United States as pro-Western and as pro-democratic. I would argue that's really a mistaken view of history. If you look back at President Yeltsin, it's clear that he also harbored anti-American animosities during his presidency, and those came to the fore when he reached the conclusion that the United States was not prepared to deal with Russia as an equal power. So Yeltsin was vehemently opposed to what the United States did in the Balkans in the 1990s. He tried to establish a troika with Germany and France to blunt American influence in Europe at that time. He also talked of a more global troika with India and China that would act as a counter, India, China, and Russia, that act as a counterweight to the United States in global affairs. All these things are similar to what Putin has done over the past 19 years. What's the difference? The difference is Russia's power. Putin can act on those ideas, on those attitudes, where Yeltsin couldn't. And I would argue that any person that succeeds Putin will also act in somewhat similar way, even if the style is a little bit different. So you're not necessarily going to see a bare-chested man riding on horseback all the time, or picking up amphora off the floor of the Black Sea and so forth. But in general, the things that will be of concern to us will be pretty much the same. So how do Russians think about international affairs in general? They belong to what they call the great power school of international relations, what we would call the realist school. Okay? So they believe that sovereign states are the central actors in global affairs, as they have been since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. They believe that private enterprise, religious organizations, non-governmental organizations are not, at the end of the day, autonomous players on the national stage or on the global stage, but rather instruments of power that are used by the states. Now, these states, by their very nature, are in a competition for power and prestige on the global stage. And that means that conflict is inevitable. Indeed, it's the essence of international affairs. In a world of competition and conflict, hard power is the coin of the realm. And beyond this, if you're sitting in the Kremlin, you don't deal with individual problems on their own merits the way the United States likes to do it, but you think about each individual problem across the broad range of challenges and problems and opportunities you face, and you try to find the optimal position that advances best your own interest in any given case. And then finally, for the Russians, and I think psychologically this is extremely important, there are only very few countries that qualify as great powers. That is, the countries that determine the structure, the substance, and the direction of global affairs. So when Russians think about international affairs, it's sovereign states, it's inevitable competition, it's hard power, it's optimal balance, and for the Russians, it's good to be a great power. Now, the Russians have argued that they have to be a great power to exist as a country, as a political community. Putin made that remark a couple of weeks ago in an address to the Federal Assembly. Said, Russia will pursue an independent foreign policy. It will be a major power. If it's not that, Russia will not exist at all. And in saying that, he has reflected the attitudes of Russian leaders and Soviet leaders and czars going back at least 300 years. So there's nothing new in that. Now, if we think about what a great power is, in a Russian definition, the first thing that comes to mind is that it's sovereign. And that means simply that it's a country that governs itself without outside interference, and it's a country that pursues an independent foreign policy in pursuit of its national interests. What is clear is that didn't define Russia in the first decade after the breakup of the Soviet Union. If you remember back to the 1990s, in Russia itself, there were these big businessmen, the so-called oligarchs, and regional leaders, regional barons, who were acting autonomously, undermining the power of Moscow itself. The West, particularly the United States, was actively interfering in the politics and economic programs of the Russian state. And when Putin came to power, one of the first goals he set for himself was restoring Russian sovereignty. So he began by reining in the powers of those oligarchs and the regional barons, re-centralizing power in the Kremlin and making its writ extend across the entire country. He then took advantage of rising oil prices and the revenue that brought in to pay down Russia's external debt to the IMF, to other foreign countries, and doing this so that Russia could escape the tutelage of Western powers over its financial and economic policies. He also began slowly to clamp down on the activities of foreign-funded NGOs and to cut off all other avenues through which foreign money could come in and affect domestic politics. And at the same time, he slowly began to reassert Russia's position on the global stage, particularly in the former Soviet space. And he did this often in opposition to the United States. Now, if you ask Putin today, he would say that he has restored Russian sovereignty. He has returned Russia to the global stage as a great power. That is probably his finest achievement in his own estimation. But Putin's a smart man, believe it or not. And if you look at the world, and as he looks at the world, he realizes that Russia faces significant challenges in sustaining itself as a great power well into the 21st century. And so what I want to do now is sort of take a step back and imagine that we are in the Kremlin and looking at the world and asking ourselves, what is it that we see? Okay. The first thing you see, obviously, is Russia. This is the largest country in the world, 11 time zones, 1/9 of the world's landmass. It's a country with the richest endowment of natural resources, in the world. It has one of the 2 largest nuclear arsenals in the world today, and it has a world-class scientific community. But this is also a country of 145 million people, with an economy that is $3 trillion. It has just exited a recession in the past year. And the economic forecasts are for a period of economic stagnation for the decade or not longer. If you look immediately beyond Russia, you have the states of the former Soviet Union. All fragile states, all with facing economic difficulties, and all open to blandishments and penetration by foreign powers. So Central Asia faces challenges from radical extremism. It's also being penetrated by other great powers, by China commercially, the Russians would argue by the United States in the security realm. The Caucasus, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia sit at the crossroads of civilizations, the Muslim world, the Asian world, and the European world, and they're being pulled in different directions, and many of them away from Russia. If you look to the Western former Soviet states, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova, you'll see that despite the current disarray in Europe, these countries are still attracted to Europe and away for Russia. So there are problems throughout the former Soviet space from the Russian standpoint. If you move beyond the former Soviet Union to the world at large, things get even more challenging for Russia. So if you look to the east, what do you see? First thing you see is China. 1.4 billion people, an $11.2 trillion economy, much larger than Russia. What's really annoying for the Russian leadership is that 25 years ago, the Russian economy was just the size of the Chinese economy. And over that 25 years, China has come to the point where its economy now is roughly 8.5 times the size of the Russian economy. And the gap is continuing to grow because despite the problems that China has, it's still growing at 4 to 6% per annum. And Russia's stuck at 1.5, 1.8% per annum. So there are problems in the East. If you look to the West, what you see is Europe, European Union, a region of 500 million people, an economy that's roughly $16.4 trillion. Now, we all know that Europe has a host of problems at this point. With Brexit, the fiscal problems, all questions about the future of the European Union. But what is also clear to the Russians is that this is still a region that is much richer than Russia and technologically far in advance of Russian capabilities. If you look to the south, what you see is a Muslim world of about 525 billion people. It's a region of fragile states, regional conflict, sectarian strife, and it's also a region that is cultivating extremist forces, and extremist forces that are radiating their influence into the southern reaches of Russia itself, the Caucasus in particular, and even farther into Russia. And then finally, when you get beyond the Eurasian continent writ large, there's the United States. 330 million people, $18.6 trillion economy. We all know that we have problems, and the Russians are quite aware of those problems, and more than willing to encourage those problems in some way. But it's also clear, if you're sitting in Moscow, that the United States remains the preeminent world power, and it's a country that doesn't seem to give much regard to Russia's national interest. And just to make the picture a bit more complicated, and perhaps gloomy from the Russian standpoint, you look to the north. Now, climate change, global warming is beginning to open up the Arctic. And there's certain opportunities that presents to Russia. There are abundant natural resources that can be developed. You can open up the Northern Sea Route, which could be a very lucrative transportation route between Asia and Europe. But from the Russian standpoint, you also have to defend this area. And for the first time in Russian history, the defense of the northern frontier becomes an urgent matter. Before, the ice protected you from outside forces invading from that route. So when you're in Russia and you look around the periphery, what you see is a host of problems that are going to face Russia and challenge Russia well into the 21st century. So what do? If you're in this situation, you're clearly not the most powerful country in the world. You're lagging behind the United States, China, many of the European countries. You see instability along your southern border. What are the tasks that you have to solve if you're going to maintain Russia as a major global power? I think there are 4 or 5 that they look at in particular. The first is that you want to reassert Russia's preeminence in the former Soviet space. This is the area that historically has given Russia geopolitical heft. Psychologically, it's critical to Russia's sense of its own security. It's fundamental to building a prosperous Russian economy. And since the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia has tried many different types of institutional arrangements to bind this region to Moscow. So we had initially the Commonwealth of Independent States. Shortly after that, they took a subset of the former Soviet space and created what they called the Collective Security Treaty Organization. 7 years ago, Putin had a better idea. He wanted to build what he called the Eurasian Union. And it was going to be modeled on on the European Union, and it was going to bring together all the former Soviet states into an economic and ultimately political entity that was dominated by Russia. They launched this Eurasian Economic Union in 2015 with Belarus, Russia, and Kazakhstan. They added Armenia and Kyrgyzstan shortly thereafter. But the big country that isn't part of this union is Ukraine. And the Eurasian Economic Union, the Eurasian Union writ large, does not make any sense without Ukraine. Ukraine is the former Soviet state with the greatest economic potential after Russia itself. Ukraine is located on the northern littoral of the Black Sea. It's a gateway into Europe, so it has tremendous strategic importance. And 5 years ago, when a Russia-friendly president was overthrown by a popular demonstration in Kiev, and it became clear to Moscow that it wasn't going to draw Ukraine into this Eurasian Union anytime soon, Putin responded by annexing Crimea, by fomenting unrest in eastern Ukraine as a way of saying that if it can't be part of the Russian sphere, the Russian Eurasian Union, I'm going to make sure that it's not going to become part of the Western sphere of influence. And no matter how the tactics have changed over the past several years, the goal remains the same: to keep Ukraine out of a Western orbit, to hope that over time you can create a set of conditions in Russia or in the global environment that brings Ukraine back into a Russian-dominated economic and political entity. So that's the first task, reasserting preeminence in the former Soviet space. The second, and we see this very an active element of Russian policy today, is to prevent or retard the consolidation of the European Union as a political and economic entity that would dwarf Russia very much the way the United States dwarfs Russia today in population, wealth, and power potential. Now, this too was something that began right after the breakup of the Soviet Union, even if Russia had very limited means to prevent that at this point. But it's clear that President Yeltsin did what he could to resist NATO expansion at that point. The Russians used their energy resources that they delivered to Europe to try to drive wedges between the various European countries by differential pricing for countries depending on their loyalty to Russia or not, trying to route it through countries that made countries like Poland dependent not only on Russia for their energy resources, but Germany as well. So to sow discord. And what we've seen, though, since 2014 and the eruption of the Ukraine crisis is a much more active effort to play on those divisions that have emerged in Europe. So a very active effort to use, again, energy as a source to push back against NATO expansion, to begin a series of provocative reconnaissance flights around the periphery of NATO, to create an increasing sense of vulnerability, particularly in states that are bordered directly on Russia, the Baltic states in particular, and Poland, to create doubts in those countries that NATO would in fact honor its Article 5 commitment to collective security if they were attacked by Russia. And by the same time, at the same time, they wanted to create, I think, somewhat alarm elsewhere in NATO that at some point they actually might have to honor those Article 5 collective security commitments. A concern that resonates particularly in countries like Italy and Spain and Greece. More recently, what we've seen this Russia do is to play on or assist all the anti-EU forces in Europe, whether they're on the right or on the left. So you can give money to Marine Le Pen's party in France. You can be supporting the Brexiteers in England or the United Kingdom at this point. You can be dealing with President Orban in Hungary and so forth. But anything that sows discord in the European Union, the Russians see at their advantage at this point. Okay? So that second task is prevent the consolidation of a united Europe. The third is to build relations to the East, in East Asia in particular. And you want to use this as a counterweight to Europe in the commercial realm. Europe now accounts for roughly a half of all Russian trade, 3/4 of all foreign direct investment in Russia. And they want to balance that to give themselves leverage in the commercial dealings with European partners. At the same time, in the strategic realm, they want to use East Asia, particularly China, as a counterbalance to the United States. Again, this is a policy that emerged in the years after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Relations between Russia and China improved throughout the Yeltsin period. They signed a treaty of good neighborliness in 2001, right after Putin assumed the presidency in Russia. But clearly it's accelerated since the eruption of the Ukraine crisis in 2014. And so Russia and China have built up a large trading relationship at this point. China has displaced Germany as Russia's largest trading partner over the past couple of years. There are a number of energy projects that are in development that will link Russian energy resources to a robustly growing Chinese market. There's much talk about a strategic partnership. President Putin and President Xi meet on a regular basis to exchange views on global affairs and to coordinate policy. And while they don't necessarily support each other entirely in their respective foreign policies, they do have an agreement that they will never oppose one another on the world stage. So that's becoming an important element of Russian foreign policy, an important element in the global environment. Now, Russia understands that there have been historical frictions with China. There's a disparity in their economic growth, and it certainly doesn't want to become overly dependent on China. And so there's a recognition in the Kremlin that Putin is part of, that at some point in the future, Russia needs to normalize its relationship with Europe, again, to create a counterbalance to China and a balanced set of economic relations that will serve Russia well over the long term and give it room to maneuver both economically and geopolitically. The fourth task is to deal and contain the instability from the south. Russia in 2015, when it sent its military forces into Syria, initially hoped that it would be able to do this in collaboration with the West. You might remember President Putin's speech before the General Assembly of the United Nations in September 2015, when he talked about building a grand coalition, grand anti-terrorist coalition that would be analogous to the grand coalition against Nazi Germany during the Second World War. There was a major terrorist attack in France shortly after that, which I think raised hopes that in fact they would be able to build this anti-terrorist coalition. It eventually ran aground because of Russia's geopolitical ambitions in the Middle East, Russia's support for the brutal Assad regime that made it nearly impossible for Western countries, European countries and the United States to cooperate fully with Russia in a counterterrorism operation in the Middle East. What you've seen since Moscow gave up hope of building this grand coalition is an effort to build regional alliances that can help it manage the problems of the Middle East. So in particular, this triangular diplomacy among Turkey, Iran, and Russia as part of an effort to bring the Syrian conflict to a satisfactory resolution as far as Moscow is concerned. You also see Moscow reaching out to Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Israel as a way of building up the types of relationships it's going to need to help manage the geopolitics of the Middle East, and in a way that is to Russia's long-term advantage. So they're trying to contain the instability in the Middle East. And the fifth and final task, the one that's probably of most importance to us, is how do you deal with the United States? And the task from the Russian standpoint is in some ways to contain the United States, or to put it in a slightly different way. Russia would like to see the United States act as a normal great power. That is, a country that doesn't think that it leads the entire global and that it is the preeminent power, that the system all depends on it, that it's building a unipolar world. It wants a United States that understands that in order to advance its own interest, it has to respect and take into account the interest of the other great powers. And that's Russia in the first instance. Now, Putin has pursued different ways of trying to transform the United States foreign policy thinking. He initially thought he could do this by building a strategic partnership with the United States. So this decision to reach out to President Bush after the 9/11 terrorist attacks to propose the formation of alliance, a counterterrorism alliance. And that worked for a couple of years. But when Putin became convinced that the United States really wasn't prepared to treat Russia as an equal power, when he saw the United States playing a much more active role in the former Soviet space, supporting governments, particularly in Georgia and Ukraine, that Putin thought were anti-Russian in orientation, he began to change his views and to look for other avenues. His assessment of the United States also took a significant change for the worse because of what I've already talked about, the less than successful conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, which Putin is convinced was made in the United States. And all these, the foreign policy and the economic programs, took some of the luster off the United States. And Putin and the Russian elite began to question whether the United States really was the model that they wanted to emulate in global affairs. And then finally, we have all the problems that have grown out of the Ukraine crisis. The anti-Russian sanctions, which, again, the Kremlin is persuaded are intended to weaken Russia, to take advantage of it, and ultimately to lead to regime change in Russia itself. So instead of an effort to build a positive relationship with the United States, Putin has looked to building other types of institutional arrangements that will act as a counterbalance to the United States. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, an organization that brings together China, India, Pakistan, and a number of Central Asian states into an economic and security organization that Putin believes will help organize the territory of Eurasia, certainly the Asian continent in particular. He's also been an advocate for the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, as an institutional arrangement that can create a counterbalance to those international financial organizations such as the World Bank and the IMF that are dominated by the United States. Okay, so he's trying to contain the United States, to turn the United States into a great power that understands that it needs to deal with Russia and respect Russia if it's going to be able to advance its own interest on the global stage. Now, what I've sketched out in these 5 tasks is a very ambitious task. And certainly I think you would be justified in questioning whether Russia has the wherewithal to achieve success on all those in all those areas. If you look at what's happening in the former Soviet space, you would already have questions about Russian ability. It's clear that the United States and China are playing a much greater role in Central Asia, despite Russia's efforts. Ukraine is still attracted to the West, despite the disarray and despite what, perhaps because of what Russia has done in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. I think the one thing that we can say that is clear is that Russia will not be able to achieve its goals unless it restores itself as the dynamic core of Eurasia. That part of Eurasia that radiates its power and influence into surrounding regions because of its economic dynamism, something that Russia has done historically. The Russian leadership recognizes that. I think the Russian leadership realizes that it has to undertake serious economic reform to unleash the capabilities, to take advantage of what still remains a very talented and creative population. It has the ability at this point to mobilize the resources for specific tasks, but it needs to make the change to unleash, as I said, the talents and the creativity you need to grow that economy over the long term and sustain or generate the economic basis you need to sustain your ambitions to be a great power globally. Now, it would do that, but there's one reason, I think in particular, that holds them back, and that's the experience of the 1980s, Gorbachev's Russia, or Soviet Union. Gorbachev clearly understood that the Soviet Union needed to reform to sustain the Soviet Union as a major power. And its process of reform, as I indicated, didn't so much unleash the creative talents of the Soviet population at that time, as unleashed the destructive forces that brought down the Soviet Union. And the Kremlin leadership today, Putin in particular, fears a perestroika 2.0 that they believe might lead to the breakup of the Russian Federation itself. And so we have what I would call a geopolitical puzzle and a domestic conundrum that faces Russia today as it tries to sustain itself as a major global power. A lot of what it does and a lot of what it says about its nuclear capabilities, I think in many ways is a mask for its own sense of vulnerability. It wants to be very active on the global stage now, in part because if you look out over the longer term, this may turn out to be the period of maximal Russian power. And Russia wants to, in a sense, establish its place in the global environment today, in the global hierarchy today, and hopes that that could last for a long time, as opposed to putting that off farther into the future when it'll be at a tremendous disadvantage against its major rivals. Now, if this analysis that I presented is anywhere close to the truth, and I think the argument is that Russia does not present this burgeoning challenge that many people in Washington face today. It's certainly a challenge that is manageable if the United States pursues it calmly and with confidence, something that we're not quite managing to do at this point. It means that our focus shouldn't be simply on containing Russia, that we have to think more broadly about this relationship. Despite the fact that Russia is probably in decline over many, many decades as a global power, for the foreseeable future, it's still going to remain a significant element in the global environment. And it's clear that there's certain things that the United States cannot do if it doesn't have at least a working relationship with Russia. If we're thinking about strategic stability, non-proliferation, these are really things that you can't do without Russia as something of a partner with the United States. If you want to stabilize the Middle East and in Europe, you're going to have to deal with Russia, and you're going to have to to make some compromises. All this is a way of saying that a policy of containment and isolation, which is being pursued by Washington at this point, really is not sufficient to define an adequate U.S.-Russia policy. It also means that our goal shouldn't be to cooperate with Russia for the sake of cooperation. We really need to take a hard-nosed look at what our interests are, how Russia impacts on those, and develop a policy that will be a combination of competition and cooperation, of resistance and accommodation, but always with the sense that we're doing this as a way of advancing our own national interests vis-a-vis Russia and more broadly in the world as a whole. In order to do that, you need to see Russia clearly. You need to see what motivates them. You just need to see where you can impact on their calculus and change their behavior in ways that are advantageous to the United States. And my concern is that in the atmosphere of Washington today, where I think we're suffering from a certain anti-Russia frenzy, when it's almost impossible for government officials to have anything that approaches normal channels of communications with the Russians, that we're really not positioned well to do what we need to do to build a relationship with Russia that works for us over the long term. So let me stop there. And I got some time for some Q&A.
Thank you.
Now, as I tell people, I'll answer any question as long as it has Russia somewhere.
Okay, if I'm not mistaken, India is very fast.
Speak loud so everyone can hear.
If I'm not mistaken, India is an extremely fast-growing economy right now. And you mentioned India with other sets. Is there anything Russia's doing to try and tap India directly?
No, absolutely. Russia has had a very good relationship with India going back to the Soviet period. If you remember back during the Cold War, India was a leader of the, what do we call it at that point? I don't want to say the third world. Neutrality, right? The non-aligned movement is much better. The non-aligned movement at that point. And they enjoyed a very good working relationship with Russia, particularly on the military side. The Indians purchased much of their military equipment from the Soviet Union. With the breakup of the Soviet Union, there was a certain decline in that activity, in part because of the socioeconomic crisis in Russia itself. It simply couldn't provide the type of equipment, particularly the military equipment, that it had provided India before. But we've seen over the past decade an effort to rebuild that relationship, driven to some extent by two things. Russia's desire to have a counterbalance in Asia proper to China, and also because the United States was actively building a strategic relationship with the Indians, and the Russians didn't want to be pushed out of the Indian market. So, I would say at this point there is a very good working relationship with India. They're a critical element of these BRICS that I've talked about. There are a lot of exchanges on security issues and so forth. A lot of economic activity as well in the nuclear realm in particular. So it's a fairly good relationship at this point. Way in the back.
Yeah, thanks. I wonder if you would comment on a comparative basis, if you can, to the U.S.'s interference in Russia's elections in the last couple of years, and especially when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State and Putin was up for re-election, as a context against what Mr. Mueller is investigating.
Yeah, it's we get asked this a lot. It's a difficult comparison to make. As I said, I think it's clear that over the years there has been some American interference in Russian in Russian elections. I was a political officer in Moscow in 1996. I know I personally interfered in Russia's election, but so did our ambassador. The difference is that almost all of the American interference has been overt. We aren't hacking into computer systems, releasing information, and so forth. So I think that is a significant difference. The social media stuff. Look, I mean, we broadcast into Russia all the time different points of views. We provide rhetorical support to forces and individuals that are clearly in opposition to the Kremlin. So what the Russians are doing on social media here, I think we tend to exaggerate that and the influence it has, and not see how that is comparable to what other countries do that have access to all these electronic sources and media divisions. We also exercise a lot of this, I think America would argue, through non-governmental organizations. Right? There's a lot of private people doing this. It's not coordinated by the American government. There's probably a greater element of coordination in Russia, but I would caution against thinking that this is all coordinated by Russia. There are a lot of freelancers in Russia as well who do things that they think will be seen as patriotic by the government. So sorting this all out is difficult. Again, I think the major difference is that most of what we do is out in front. We don't cover it up. We try to explain it in a different way. And there's a covert element of what the Russians have done that I think is problematic for us, for other countries, and certainly an issue that we're going to have to address in a much better way than we have up to this point. Never know who to. I'll start down here.
If you could just briefly comment on the cultural and religious side of the tension moving from the more political and economic. And I wonder to what extent in this regard Russia views itself not as an enemy of the West, but as the last great defender of Western civilization in general and Christianity in particular. And to what extent that plays into their thinking of Putin and they see the West as the Pussy Riot problems of the threat, but also the extent to which this plays into their strategic thinking, looking at possible collapse in the West parallel to that in the Soviet Union.
Wait, can you just repeat the question so the people in the back can hear?
If I repeat the question, I can't answer the question I want to answer. The question was whether I could address the sort of religious and societal elements of this. I mean, it's clear that Putin is presenting in Russia in many ways as a defender of traditional European values. And could I comment on that? And so the answer to the question is yes. I mean, this is a large part of this. Putin made a major speech a few years ago, in fact, focused on what he saw as the growing decadence in this West, the unwillingness to defend what he saw as traditional European values, and it has to do with the Pussy Riots, the secularization of the West as compared to what he would argue is the continued spirituality in Russia itself. It's the way we deal with various social, gender, and other issues in the United States that he sees as a fundamental contradiction or outright attack on what our core Western values. So he has presented himself as that, and Russians do. Political correctness is not something that the Russians are known for. They laugh at that all the time. What we're doing in terms of gender equality in the United States and the way we're redefining gender here is a big problem for much of the Russian political elite. And they do that in part because Russian society itself is very, very conservative. And so this resonates with a large segment of the Russian population. But I think they also realize that this resonates with a certain segment of Western societies. And so there is a certain affinity between Russia and some of the right wing, the religious fundamentalists in the United States, and they see that as a source of power and influence. So I think Putin would argue that this is an element of Russia's soft power. We propagate and advocate a view of social relations, of religiosity that actually has a potential reservoir of support in the Western world. And again, I think that's part of the contradiction that we see between the two countries, United States and Russia at this point, particularly between the two elites that tend to dominate any discussion of foreign policy. Okay, back here, and then I'll come down here.
I was wondering to what extent the history of Russia being invaded from the West still has an effect on its relationship with Europe, or whether that's disappeared.
But look, this is a fundamental element of Russian strategic thinking. And it's not only invasion from the West. If you go back farther in history, there's invasion from the East as well. Russia is located on this European plain. There are very few barriers. It's very easy to move across territory, and they have been invaded at least once a century by an outside power. The 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries by European power. So they remember that. They're focused on that. What is the way they have dealt with that? They've tried to push the borders outward, away from the Russian heartland. So you build buffer zones. And this is still very much an element in Russian strategic thinking at this point. So Ukraine, Belarus, Russia wants those as part of a Russian-dominated political entity because that creates that buffer zone against Western powers. If you listen to what Putin is saying about his concerns about the U.S. withdrawal from the INF treaty now, part of that concern is that the United States will be able to place those types of missiles in Poland. If you place them in Poland, the flight time to Moscow, he said 10 to 12 minutes, actually a little bit less than that, I think. But that creates what Russians would say is the threat of a decapitating first strike by the United States that would prevent Russia from retaliating in a way. So this mutually assured destruction, the Russian deterrent breaks down under that regard. So territory is very important. He would feel much more comfortable if Russia still controlled Poland and Eastern Germany, and those missiles, if they had to be placed anywhere in Europe, would be placed in Western Germany, France, or elsewhere. So the short answer is that is an important element of their thinking. They want buffer zones. That I think is critical to their own sense of psychological security in the modern world. Down here?
I've always been under the impression that world powers of modern era have gotten that way because of strong industrialization and strong economies. And as the last time I looked, about 85% of Russia's exports were extractions, oil, gas, minerals, and so forth. Is that, in your opinion, going to come and haunt them in their inability just to fund or extend their influence?
Yeah, I think when people look at Russia over the longer term, that's exactly one of the things that they think about, is that you won't be able to sustain yourself as a major global power if the economy is built on extractive resources, that you have to move up the value chain, that you have to be competitive across a broad range of sectors that matter in the modern world. Particularly in the information and communication sector, a lot of other stuff that we're doing on the high-tech side at this point. And this is a real problem for Russia. Russia devotes very little of its GDP to research and development. It's about 1% 1.2%, something like that, 3 or 4 times what the United States does relative to GDP. The Russians are aware of that. They talk about diversifying their economy. They've talked about diversifying, the need to diversify their economy for 20 years now. They develop programs to do that. They never quite get there, in part because of the political consequences of diversification. The elite survives off the rents that it gets off of the extractive resource, particularly oil and gas. If you're going to move towards high tech, you really have to find ways to unleash the creativity of the Russian population, and that means opening up the society to some extent. Well, what are the political implications of doing that? Do these people who are creative in the scientific sphere, or all of a sudden they get the idea that they ought to have a greater say in the political process? So it's how you square this circle, which is a real problem for the Russians at this point. So I agree with you. That's true. The question I think you have to ask for the policy side is, when does the long term kick in? Right? Is it because it makes a difference if it's 2024, 2030, or 2060. What I think is clear at this point is, despite the structure of the Russian economy, Russia still has the ability, as it has had historically, to concentrate its efforts in those areas that are critical to its developing its hard power resources. So you see that particularly now. Cyberspace. The Russians have made a major effort in developing the tools of cyberspace and thinking about how you deploy those tools to maximum advantage. So a lot of the hacking, the other things that they're doing on the disinformation side comes out of cyberspace. It's also clear that they are using Ukraine as something as a test bed for cyber weapons themselves. They have taken down elements of the Ukrainian electrical grid, for example, to see what types of societal reactions you get, but also to see to what extent they can control that there aren't spillover effects. So again, you need to distinguish between the long term and the short and medium term, which I think are much more important to us as we try to formulate a policy. And in the short and medium term, despite the structure of their economy, I still think they're going to have the capabilities they need to play a large role in global affairs. Okay, take it here and then over here. Right here, yellow jacket.
Given the lens through which we see Russia today, at least some of us, messing in our internal affairs, supporting Assad and destroying his people, the other things that we all read about, how should Washington, in your opinion, then try to normalize relations with Russia?
Look, I mean, I don't want to leave the impression that we don't face challenges from Russia, right? There are significant differences that we have with Russia on the way we think the world order should be structured, the geopolitical conflicts, some of those that you've just pointed to, Assad in Syria, for example. And there is a fundamental gap between the values that we hold, that we think should inform the structure of domestic political processes. So it is a competitive relationship. And I think the question that we need to ask ourselves in Washington is, how do we manage this competitive relationship so that we reduce the risk of our winding up in a confrontation that neither side desires? It's a little bit like the challenge we faced during the Cold War, where it's clear that there was a major divide between the two countries. Much of what the Soviet Union did we disapproved of, but because of the size of the nuclear arsenal, because of the threat of the existential threat that posed, that we had to sort of work carefully with Russia to reduce that threat. So what I think you need to do at a minimum at this point, without sort of offering solutions to the specific problem, you have to open up the channels of communication. You have to be talking to the Russians. It makes no sense to use the withdrawal of diplomatic communications as a punishment for the Russians. We shouldn't think of diplomatic relations as a reward. Diplomatic relations are a tool for managing a very complex relationship. So open up the channels of communication. Talk to the Russians about the broad range of issues that are important to us and are problematic on the U.S.-Russian relationship, and then see whether you can devise sort of rules of the road that will help us manage the competition in ways that are less dangerous to both sides. The second part of this is that if we're going to deal with the Russians effectively on issues like Ukraine or Syria or anything else, we really have to have an idea of what we want, right? And I think that's the fundamental problem that we have in Washington today. There's no sense of what, or there's no consensus on what America's role should be in the world. Should we be in Syria? If we're in Syria, for what reasons? What's the cost that will entail? What are the benefits we hope to get from that? We can ask that across a broad range of issues. And I think we're so much focused on sort of the partisan battles in Washington, and that we're dealing with much of this in a very sort of emotional state as opposed to sort of the objective. Let's begin to define clearly what American national interests are, decide what it is we want, and if you tell me what it is we want, then I can begin to formulate a policy for how we need to deal with Russia. So those are I think, the problems that we have at this point. There's another back here.
This is a question that's sort of more broad. It says, comparison. This is a bigger question about when one says the Russians or one says the Americans. We recently read a book called A Gentleman in Moscow. It's a glorious book about the Russians, I guess. And there was a moment there where there was a German visitor who confronted the lead character and said, well, what do you people have anyway? And I'm curious, from all of your history with Russians, and it's such a big country with all these other kinds of nationalities, I mean, as an American, I would say, I guess I most identify myself as America is great because it has this constitutional republic. That's something I feel would be wonderful all Americans could find around. I'm curious your view about when you're with Russians, what do they feel they find around Russia?
I thought you were going to ask a different question. I thought you were going to ask, aren't you aware that there are differences in the way Russians think about global? And I was going to say yes. I mean, obviously, there are differences and there are different groups.
Also the differences.
And significant differences. You try to identify those. But if you're doing this from the policy standpoint, the focus is always on that group you think is playing the largest role in defining what the foreign policy is. The group that you have to influence if you're going to be able to impact on Russian behavior. And then I think some of the things I outlined are views that reproduce themselves generation of leading Russian decision makers. This sort of idea, I think one of the things that is shared by Russians is this sense of the size, the bigness of the country, and the sense that they ought to play a large role in global affairs, in part because of that size, because of who they are. It's a very resilient population, as we've seen throughout history, particularly the Second World War, that is prepared to endure great suffering in order to protect the country when it's attacked from the outside. And this is something that Putin plays on by trying to create that external enemy. By the same token, the Russians are rarely very good on offensive operations. If Germany attacks you and drives its forces all the way to Stalingrad, you turn that around. You'll race them all the way back to Berlin. But that's quite different from launching an operation that's unprovoked against a foreign country and having your forces operate as effectively as they would in self-defense. So defend the country. It ought to be a big player in global affairs. And the other thing that I think that binds them to get the sense that we're tough. We're tough, we're resilient. We are survivors. We are the world's great survivors, and we've demonstrated that over 1,000 years, which is another way of saying we can do all you want about long-term decline, this, that, and the other thing. Don't count us out because we're not going anyway. Over here.
So considering that treaties have often led to conflict in our past world history, do you think it's time now for us to reassess NATO with respect to Russia and Europe?
Look, I mean, we need to reassess everything at this point. I think it's clear, and people talk about this more now than they did previously. We're moving into a different period in the global environment. It's not only the rise of China, although that's an important element of it. It's the broader rise of Asia. We're developing new technologies that are going to change the way we think about the way we communicate, the way we work. If artificial intelligence takes off the way some people are saying at this point, it's going to change the way we think about how we think. And so, how does the United States position itself in the world? What are our real interests? How do we go about advancing those interests? Ought to be the subject of a large debate in the United States. And that clearly leads to NATO. What is NATO's purpose? How should the United States relate more broadly to countries that we have considered our transatlantic partners over the past 60, 70 years? How does that impact on our relations with Russia? One of the questions that you ought to ask about NATO at this point is, does NATO need to expand? One of the fundamental points of contention between the United States and Russia concerns Ukraine and Georgia, and whether those countries should be part of NATO or not. Whether they should or shouldn't be, to some extent, is a function of what we think NATO's for. And so we ought to have that debate. And we ought to be able to have that debate without people saying that if you don't think Ukraine should become a part of NATO, that you're a Russian agent, because that's the Russian position. You go back to the 1990s, when we had this first debate over NATO expansion in the post-Soviet world. There were eminent Americans on both sides of that issue. And there was never a suggestion that people who were opposed to NATO expansion at that point were somehow unpatriotic, un-American, were playing into Russia's hands, although that was Russia's position at that point. We need to be able to have that same calm debate now, which is the assumption that most of the people engaged in the debate are genuine patriots. They care about America's interest, but they realize that we can pursue these things in different ways in the world, and we ought to have an honest debate, weighing the cost and benefits as a way of coming to a national consensus, as opposed to using the anti-Russian or Putin trope as a way of cutting off what I think is a very necessary debate in the United States. Question over here?
Let's take one last question.
I'd like to take the NATO theme a little further. About over 10 years ago, Jim Baker at a talk at Yale, recounted assurances that were given at the end of the Soviet Union and in the period immediately after, that the United States would not aggressively or be perceived as aggressively moving the boundaries of NATO right up to the boundaries of Russia
Right.
and the Commonwealth of Independent States. And your comments now about, we should have a debate about that, well, that seems to me somewhat long after the fact, where people, for example, even Hillary Clinton, were pushing for expansion of NATO into the Ukraine and elsewhere. So is the perception of Putin and Russia being aggressive towards the United States, or have we created our own blowback by moving NATO, essentially breaching what Baker's commitments, if that are regarded as commitments, and provocatively moving NATO right up to the Russian border? And again, so if we integrate also Putin's famous comments to your colleague at the Kissinger Associates, Henry Kissinger, at that famous St. Petersburg dinner, where Putin says to him, sitting next to him at the dinner table, I'm fully aware of what you all did to pull the Soviet Union, to disintegrate the Soviet Union. And Kissinger at various points has said amusedly, oh, well, that we really didn't do that. But, so I suppose my question is what role did we play in creating, let's say, what's going on now?
Okay, they're good questions, and historians will debate this for a long time. I make one point about the breakup of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union broke up largely because of external factors. We were minor players in that. In fact, President Bush, 41, went to Kiev in the summer of 1991, urging the Ukrainians to back away from independence, because our desire was actually to deal with Gorbachev and the Soviet Union as a whole and managing a lot of global issues at that point. It's somewhat similar to what's happening in the United States today. The problems here we've generated on our own. They're ours to solve. The Russians may play on the margins of this, but they're not the people sowing the discontent in this country. So I wish political leaders and those who engage in the political debate, whether the Russians or Americans, would assume their own burden of responsibility for what happens domestically in their own countries, and stop pointing to foreign powers as the reason why they can't do what they know they need to do domestically. Point one. Point two, the NATO is a difficult issue. I've gone back and read the documents at this, and Baker's statements at that point. And at the time this was about German reunification, it clearly applied to expansion of NATO forces in Eastern Germany as part of reunification process. Whether it extended beyond that is an open question, because who knew that the Warsaw Pact was going to break up at that point? Gorbachev has said that there was no firm commitment by the United States to not expand NATO at this point. And he said that 3 or 4 years ago. The reason that Gorbachev never asked for a firm commitment was he was thinking about something else at that point. He was thinking about building a European security architecture that would use NATO and the Warsaw Pact as its foundation. So somehow reconciling those differences and building a pan-European security architecture. In a sense, he would have overcome the issue of NATO expansion, because it wouldn't have been necessary in that environment, never pushed for it. So I think the Russians have exaggerated that point for political purposes. That said, it's clear after the first round of NATO expansion, or as we went into it, the Russians were adamantly opposed to NATO expansion, and that the continued expansion of NATO did create increasing concerns in Russia as to what our long-term intentions were. And so we should have stepped back I think, after the first round of expansion, and asked ourselves whether a second wave of expansion serves our purposes in what ways, and how we're going to deal what is clearly Russian adamant opposition to that type of expansion. We did the second wave of expansion when I was in the Bush administration, largely because we thought the Russians couldn't push back, and they couldn't. We then wanted to push into Ukraine and Georgia, I think under a similar set of assumptions that the Russians couldn't do anything to prevent us from doing that. The Russians demonstrated that they could use force to prevent that from happening. That, at the minimum, ought to give us concerns about the continued process of NATO expansion eastward into the former Soviet space. Again, does this serve our interest or not? How does it impact on our relations with Russia? What's the overall cost-benefit analysis? So the answer I would give to your question is, I think the Russians have misconstrued the actual conversation for their own political advantage at this point. At the same time, as we've gotten further into this process, we should have been aware and taken into account much more than we did the Russian resistance and the ways in which Russia could respond that would complicate very much what we're trying to do in the world and complicate an effort to build a relationship with Russia that is less conflictual than it is at this point.
So thank you so much.